Music box. Jackdaw, jackdaw, how pretty you sing. We'll visit the Duke, we'll visit the King. Colette opened her eyes. Her window's curtains fluttered in the cool night air, allowing thin slices of moonlight to slink across her bed. It had been a long time since she'd last dreamed of the nursery rhyme she'd been forbidden to sing. It must be at least 10 years now since I last heard it. Colette sat up in bed and ran her fingers through her hair to untangle it. She couldn't remember what she'd been dreaming about, but the song had been clear enough. Jackdaw, jackdaw, how pretty you sing, she whispered to herself. She couldn't remember beyond the first 2 lines, though she'd once had the entire song memorized. In the decade since she'd last heard it, Colette had almost forgotten the drama surrounding the tune. The dream had brought it all back, though the events were hazy and out of order. She dug her thumbs into the corners of her eyes as she struggled to remember. She found the little music box on the front porch while letting her cat out before school. It was a small round container, the type that opened up when its key was twisted and had a tiny ballerina twirling on one leg. Colette wanted to know who had left it so she could thank them. Her mother guessed it was a friend or a neighbor. Colette played with the box for a solid hour that afternoon, reciting the tinkling song. Jackdaw, jackdaw, how pretty you sing. We'll visit the Duke, we'll visit the King. At bedtime, she'd put it into her toy chest, carefully nestled amongst the stuffed bears and the worn building blocks. She woke in the early hours of the morning to find the box on her dressing table, the little ballerina twirling as the eerie song echoed through the room. Her first thought was that her mother had put it there as a surprise. She turned it off, stuffed it inside her wardrobe, and went back to bed. The following morning, a large black bird had hopped after her while she walked to school. Throughout the day, any time she looked out the classroom windows, she caught sight of the creature perched in a nearby tree. Colette didn't touch the music box that evening but left it in the bottom of her wardrobe. When it woke her, she was irritable enough to carry it to her mother's room. "Stop turning it on," she demanded, slamming the box onto the small bedside table as her mother sat up groggily. "I want to sleep." The following day, 3 black birds cawed at her as she walked through the park. Another 5 hovered in the car park when she left school. For a 3rd night running, the mournful tune woke her shortly after 2 in the morning. The box stood open on her dresser, the ballerina spinning tirelessly. When Colette took it to her mother, demanding an explanation, her mother retorted with questions of her own. Had Colette taken it out of the garbage? How had she known it had been thrown away? It didn't take long for the line of questioning to change. Had Colette been talking to strangers? Did she let anyone into the house? The night ended with Colette's mother taking the music box to the pond 2 streets down from their house and throwing it in. That morning, when Colette opened the door to go to school, she found her front lawn filled with blackbirds. They fluttered and cawed as they saw her. Sitting on the front porch was the music box. It popped open as she looked at it, and the tinny tune surrounded her. Jackdaw, jackdaw, how pretty you sing. We'll visit the Duke, we'll visit the King. She wasn't allowed to go to school that day. Instead, she and her mother stayed indoors and watched the music box burn in the fireplace. That had been the last of the song and the last of the blackbirds. Colette had been forbidden from repeating the tune, and gradually, the memories had faded. Colette sat with her knees pulled up in front of her chest, just like she had that day. The memory had been so lost that it felt like digging a time capsule out of her mind. True to her promise, she had not sung the song since the music box had been burnt. 3 brief, twanging notes cut through the silent night. Colette drew a breath and turned towards the window. A small twirling silhouette was visible behind the gauzy curtains. Slowly, cautiously, she moved towards it and pulled the fabric aside. The music box waited on her windowsill, charred and partially melted. The ballerina's sweet face had been distorted so that she looked as though she were screaming. Her raised leg was bent at an odd angle, but she continued to move in small, sharp jerks as the song twanged out of the long dormant player. Colette raised her eyes towards the trees outside her window. Hundreds of beady eyes stared back. One of the birds shuffled, and its movement spurred the others into motion until the swarm of black creatures was flapping, cawing, and cackling at her. She took a step back from the window. The birds swooped. They moved as one mass, pouring through the open window, enveloping her, and muffling her scream. In an instant, the room was emptied. All that was left behind was a scattering of black feathers and the charred music box that continued to play its broken song. Jackdaw, jackdaw, how pretty you sing. We'll visit the Duke, we'll visit the King. Jackdaw, jackdaw, sing over my bed but break my sleep, and I'll wake up dead. Next story. Ghost Town. Here she is. Gary slowed the van to a crawl as it entered the cluster of buildings that comprised Prayer Town. He leaned forward, straining his bulk against the seatbelt, to get a better look at the stone and wood houses. So this is what a ghost town looks like. Beth was huddled deep into her seat, as though pulling back could physically move her away from the deserted buildings. She glared at the dashboard resolutely. Great. You've seen it. Let's move on. Not just yet, Gary said in the most placating tone he could manage. Beth shot him a glare. We've taken a 2-hour detour to get here. We may as well enjoy it. 2 hours. Beth gasped. I only agreed because you said it was virtually on our path. Eh. Gary pulled up in the middle of the town and parked the car. Yes, well, either way, it would be a damn shame not to have a poke around. I swear. Beth's voice was dangerously low. If this makes us late for Sarah's christening, course it won't, love. Gary risked giving his wife's cheek a peck, then opened the door and got out. The streets, filled with dust and long-dead weeds, stretched away to either side. He rubbed his hands together and moved towards one of the closer buildings, which he guessed must have been either a large house or a small hotel. The door opened without protest. Inside was cool and dark, and the air smelt faintly mildewy. Gary paused in the foyer to appreciate the wooden ceiling and stained plaster on the walls. Like many pioneering towns, Prayer had been built in a rush, and it showed. The rough-hewn wood was mostly unpainted, and the carpet was shabby. Gary moved deeper into the building, glancing through doorways and trying to guess the room's purposes. Much of the furniture had been taken, but larger fixtures such as the desks and shelves had been left behind. It wasn't until he pushed into a particularly large room and saw a saloon's bar against one wall that he realized it must have been the town's hotel. Gary approached the bar and wiped a finger through the thick reddish dust blanketing it, then he turned quickly as a chuckle from somewhere deeper in the building disturbed him. It had sounded like a child, but the noise had been so faint that Gary wasn't entirely sure he'd even heard it. Probably another holidaying family stopping off. Gary returned to the foyer. A staircase rose to his right, the fabric on the steps well-worn and faded. Gary cast a final glance towards the front doors, where he knew his irritable wife would be waiting with the car, then hurried up the stairs. She won't mind another minute or two. Halfway to the second floor, Gary froze. He'd heard it again, children's voices, too faint to make out their words. Only this time, they'd come from the upstairs rooms. The stairs opened onto a long, narrow hallway. To the left, a window overlooked the main street. He could see Beth, forced out of the car by the heat, leaning on their van's hood. She still had her arms crossed, and he could picture her chewing at her lip like she did every time things didn't go her way. He turned back to the hallway and tried the first door. It opened into a classic hotel room and, to his surprise, much of the furniture was still intact. The bed, the mattress, and even the bedside table were still in place. If someone wanted to come in here and haul away the furniture, they could make a small fortune pawning it at a second-hand store. Laughter echoed through the hallway, and Gary swiveled as the shock sent his heart rate up. The sounds were closer than they had been before. One of the children seemed to be singing. Gary tried to make out the tune, but he didn't recognize it. Suddenly uncomfortable in the deserted hotel, Gary moved back into the hallway. He glanced in each direction, and saw a flash of motion at the end of the hallway. There was a small gap between the door and its frame, and someone had darted past it. "Hello." The giggles intensified, and Gary felt a flush of frustration. Their parents shouldn't be letting them run around unsupervised like this. Where are their parents, anyway? I didn't see any other cars in the street. Against his better judgment, George edged towards the final room. The children whispered to each other and then paused to giggle. Something was not quite right about their laughter, though. Earlier, it had been merry and bright, but the newer giggles had a malicious edge to them. Like the way children laugh when they pull an insect's wings off. Gary stretched out a hand and nudged open the door. The hinges groaned as the wooden board moved inwards. The room was completely empty, except for the marks of small bare feet in the dust on the floor. Gary licked at his dry lips as he edged into the room. "Hello." The voices had fallen silent. Gary looked about, but there was nowhere to hide in the vacant space. Unless they got out through the window. He approached the frame. The room was on the second floor, and he couldn't see any way for a child, let alone multiple children, to get out without making a lot of noise. The window overlooked the main stretch of road, and Gary saw his car waiting below. The dark green paint stood out starkly against the red soil. Beth was no longer leaning against the hood. Gary bent forward to rest his head against the cold glass and squinted. His wife wasn't inside the car, either. Gary's insides turned cold. He knew his wife too well to think she had wandered after him or gone to explore on her own. The door behind him slammed, and Gary jumped. Raucous, malicious giggles came from the other side of the door, accompanied by the patter of running feet. "Hey," Gary yelled, lurching towards the door. "Hey, what the hell?" He grasped the handle and tugged on it, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled and pushed. Then he shoved his shoulder into the door to no avail. He tried not to scream as a child's hand, icy cold, fastened around his neck. Next story. Magpie Girl. Henry lay on his back, his eyes fixed on the shadows slinking across the ceiling. It was one of the nights when he found it impossible to sleep. Far below his apartment window, a car horn blared. Sirens wailed in the distance. Two men, their words slurred, were arguing. By the sounds of it, at least one of them would end up in the hospital. There was once a time when Henry would have cared. He'd gone into the police force with great expectations for himself and his career. "I won't be like the others," he'd told himself. "I won't go crooked. Every move, every action, will be for the benefit of this city I love." If it had been any other sort of night, he might have laughed at his own naivety. Instead, all he could do was watch the shadows, which looked so much like a woman's fingers. He'd made mistakes along his path, of course. Laziness had gotten the better of him on a few occasions and delayed justice. He'd accepted a couple of bribes. Looking back on it, he was almost certain he'd sent an innocent man to jail. But his worst offense, the mistake that haunted him into his old age, was the Magpie Girl. He'd been on shift when she'd come into the station. One glance at her was all he needed to make an assessment. Her hoodie was old and stained. She wore leggings, even though it was winter. Her hair, bleached blonde with the brown roots showing, had been dragged into a messy bun on the top of her head. The way she held herself, slouched, her shoulders hunched and head down, and the dark circles around her eyes had earned her a damning label, druggy. At the time, Henry had been proud of himself for listening patiently to her story. He'd heard some wild stuff in his days, but hers had taken the cake. Her boyfriend was into occult stuff, she said. He owns a heap of those old books with weird symbols on their covers, she'd said. He's building up to something bad, trying to trap a soul to its body. Henry had idly wondered what she was on. One of the psychedelic drugs, he'd assumed at first, but her focus and intensity made him lean more towards coke or possibly even an experimental custom brew. Her story had gradually grown wilder, and Henry had been too fascinated to stop her. She claimed her boyfriend was a serial killer, on top of being into the occult. He's been taking prostitutes, she'd said, speaking rapidly. He's experimenting on them. It never works, of course, but he keeps trying. When they die, he bags them and hides them in our apartment wall. There've been so many of them. At least 12 in the last year. Does he space them out to one a month, Henry had asked, or did he blow through his budget in a few weeks? It had been a joke. A stupid, cruel, horrible joke. If Henry were capable of going back in time, he would have slapped himself. A range of expressions crossed the woman's face. Henry had glimpsed confusion, then shock, then hurt that was quickly hidden behind outrage. You're supposed to help, she spat, pulling back from the desk. I can help you get into rehab, Henry had said, unable to keep the laughter out of his voice. As she'd stormed out of the station, one of Henry's co-workers gave him a look that clearly said, "Did you have to go that far?" Subconsciously, Henry had known he'd crossed a line. He even felt a twinge of shame as the station's door slammed. But other matters had pulled on his attention, and the mysterious woman was all but forgotten by the end of the day. He'd thought he would never see her again. As he lay in his room, watching the shadows at 2 in the morning, as far from sleep as it was possible for a human to be, Henry would have given anything to have been right. A week later, he'd responded to reports of a homicide in one of the worst parts of the city. He recognized the girl immediately. Her eyes were a little more sunken, and the dark hair roots a few millimeters farther advanced than he remembered, but the face was familiar. The rest of her was borderline unrecognizable. She'd been laid out in the center of the shabby room, her blood seeping into the cheap gray carpet, her hair spread in a halo about her head. Her killer had sliced her open with surgical precision and peeled strips of her skin back, laying it out beside her like an animal hide rug. Henry couldn't even fathom what had been done to her. Candles had been placed on exposed rib bones. Ink ran between her intestines and a congealed mess of something that pathology had later identified as chicken blood was mixed in. Henry's partner had fled from the room to retch in the hallway. The shock had lasted for a long time. No one else seemed to remember the girl's visit to the police station, and Henry, terrified of what the repercussions could be if his negligence made it into the papers, kept his lips sealed. He tried to remember as much of the bizarre discussion as he could, but it only came back in fragments. One part that had stuck with him was the imagery of a multitude of bodies bagged and stored in the walls. He'd nonchalantly instructed some junior officers to search behind the plaster for possible hidden weapons, and, sure enough, a cascade of decaying, ghost-white, plastic-shrouded bodies tumbled from behind a fake wall. A suspect was apprehended. The trial dragged on for years. Every time he was called up to give testimony, Henry had wanted to tell them how the girl had come to see him just a week before her death and told him about her serial-killing, occult-obsessed boyfriend. But every time, a sense of self-preservation had stilled his tongue, and he stuck to his official alibi, that the first he knew of the business was the day he'd arrived at the apartment. A combination of wormy lawyers and a lack of evidence saw the suspect go free. As far as the state was concerned, it was an unsolved case. The police were still working on it, picking up tips as they came in and hoping to get lucky, but there wasn't much hope of a resolution. The killer had been perfectly methodical with his butchering. If he'd left DNA, it hadn't been found. The apartment had been rented under a fake name, and no one knew much of anything about the occupants, who'd arrived and left in the early hours of the morning. They never even figured out the girl's real name. The media had named her after the apartment block, the Magpie Girl. Henry didn't have any doubts about the killer's identity, though. He'd seen the way the boy had smirked and the non-guilty verdict was handed down. He wondered if the man was still free, possibly living in another part of the country under an assumed name, possibly carrying out more of his bizarre and morbid experiments. Henry had resigned himself to the idea that he would probably never hear the full story. The shadows across the ceiling, so much like women's fingers, twitched and quivered. They began dragging themselves across the plaster, towards Henry's door. He always shut the door when he went to bed, but it always somehow ended up open at that terrible hour of 3 in the morning. The shadows slid down the walls and collected in a pool on the ground. Then came the noises, the scraping, dragging sounds that echoed unnaturally through the room. The gurgle of a breath being pulled through damaged lungs. The rasp of flesh being dragged across carpet. Henry turned his head towards the doorway, where a dark shape was dragging itself into his room. "Leave me alone," he begged for what felt like the 100th time. "I'm sorry. Leave me alone." The corpse raised its head, as it always did, and Henry caught a glimpse of her body, sliced open, the flaps of skin dragging across the carpet. Her eyes, cold and dead, fixed on the retired policeman, and the Magpie Girl stretched a hand forward to drag herself closer to her victim. Next story. Hazard lights. Maria leaned against the car door and stared through the window at the harsh white lights spaced along the Lane Cove tunnel. The driver kept trying to start a conversation, but she'd caught a red-eye flight and was beyond exhausted. All she wanted to do was get to her hotel and sleep for a lifetime. The traffic wasn't cooperating, though. It had been gridlocked for the last 20 minutes, and in the tunnel, it seemed even worse. Maria didn't think they'd moved more than 10 meters in the last 5 minutes. Bad traffic today, yeah. The taxi driver, a cheerful man with a thick black beard, beamed at her in the rear vision mirror, and Maria mustered a thin smile. Aha. Haven't seen it this bad in months. Must be a breakdown ahead. Maria turned to look out of the opposite window, where she could see 5 other car lanes, 2 more going in their direction, the other 3 going the opposite, all forced to a halt. Every now and then, a car would crawl a few inches closer to its leader, as though that would make any sort of difference. The radio came to life with a crackle, and Maria jumped. She'd nearly fallen asleep. "We are currently experiencing an emergency situation," the voice on the radio said, and Maria leaned forward to listen to it. Her driver hadn't touched the radio, she knew, by the way his face had gone pale. However, because the tunnel dipped below ground to carry cars from one side of the harbor to the other, the control room had the ability to activate the car's radios in an emergency. "Remain in your vehicle," the voice said. He sounded flustered and panicky, though he was clearly reading from a script. "Extinguish all lights and remain silent. Assistance will be sent as soon as possible." The radio fell silent. Maria looked to her taxi driver, whose face had lost almost all color. He turned the key in the ignition, powering the car down and killing its lights. Around her, other cars were also being turned off. Maria swiveled in her seat to look behind her. She thought she could hear noises coming from deeper in the tunnel. Then the multitude of lights spaced along the concrete walls whined and died, plunging them into darkness. Someone shrieked, and car doors slammed. A handful of headlights were still on, and Maria tried to see what was happening through the limited glow, but everything was a mess of shadows and shapes. The radio crackled for a second time, and the voice returned. Its panic had risen to a nearly hysterical pitch, and he didn't seem to be reading from a script any longer. "They say you should remain in your cars, but they're still finding you. Don't run. Don't bother. They'll catch you. They're spreading so fast. I've never seen or heard of anything like this before. Oh, geez, I'm so sorry. Stay in your cars. Stay." The voice broke off with a gasp, and Maria heard a banging noise in the distance followed by what sounded like metal being twisted and torn. The radio clicked off. Maria sat frozen in her seat as she stared at her driver. A car a few rows ahead turned on its hazard lights, and the flashing red reflected off the driver's face as he stared back. Then the scream started. Maria turned to look behind them and saw shapes, people, running between the cars. It was more than panic, it was pandemonium. Several figures shoved against her taxi as they ran past, making its way. Maria placed one hand on the car door, preparing to exit and join the crowd, but she stopped when she caught sight of other, larger shapes farther back in the tunnel. They were barely visible in the blinking hazard light, but they were definitely not human. The shapes moved on all fours, dexterously climbing over the cars and scuttling along the tunnel's walls. Their limbs had at least 4 joints each, and they were larger than an average man. They snatched up the fleeing humans so quickly that the motions were a blur. Maria heard the crackles and snaps of breaking bones underneath the screams. Glass smashed as the creatures pounded through car windows. "Get down," the taxi driver hissed, shoving Maria out of her seat so that she was kneeling in the footwell. She flattened herself as much as she could, trying to breathe through her mouth to minimize the noise. The taxi driver sunk back into his seat, his eyes wide as he tried not to shake. From her position, Maria could still see the figures racing past the windows and feel the impact as they bumped the car. Then the taxi shuddered as something large and heavy landed on it, and one of the running figures by her window was pulled from view with a gurgling shriek. Maria pressed her hand over her mouth and held her breath. They were enveloped by silence for a second, then there was a horrific crash as the windshield was broken by a long, tough limb. The taxi driver barely managed half a scream before he was torn out of his seat and pulled through the hole in the windshield. His voice choked off, then, and dark liquid splashed across the window above Maria. The sounds were changing as the screams faded into the distance. The human cacophony was replaced by steady, loud thuds as the creatures climbed over the cars, making snapping noises and chewing, tearing sounds. Maria squeezed her eyes closed so that she wouldn't have to watch the shadows move past the window. She kept still until the noises died into the distance and were eventually entirely extinguished. Her muscles ached from the cramped position. Outside, the tunnel remained dark except for the hazard lights, which continued to bathe the area in intermittent flashes of red. She was surrounded in near-perfect silence, no footsteps, voices, thudding limbs, or tearing flesh. Maria shook as she slowly, cautiously rose to her knees. She peeked through the car's window, between the streaks of blood, to see that the tunnel seemed empty. So did the cars. Their human occupants had been stripped from them, pulled through broken windows or holes that had been carved in the metal. Maria alone had been spared, thanks to her hiding place. "I've got to leave before those creatures come back. There should be emergency exits placed along the walls. They should be too small for those things to fit through easily. If I can just get to one of them." Maria opened her door slowly and silently. The car's interior lights automatically turned on in response, and Maria looked out, frozen in terror, as a dozen pairs of reflective, globe-like eyes turned toward her. Next story. The Resident. Allie shifted the crowbar to her left hand as she glanced up and down the length of the plywood boards covering the space below her home. The crawl space had been boarded up since before Allie bought the property. The real estate agent had said it would make an excellent storage space, though. And with another 5 months, until the weather would be warm enough to work in her garden, Allie figured she might as well put the storage space to use and clear up her yard. Allie approached one of the plywood boards and pressed the tip of her crowbar into the narrow gap above it. The wood had discolored from years of exposure to the weather, but it had held up surprisingly well. It groaned, creaked, and cracked as Allie forced the gap wider, then it broke free with a loud snap. She pulled the board away and threw it aside, leaving a 2-foot opening into the crawlspace. She dropped the crowbar and picked up the torch she'd sat on the porch. Allie angled the harsh white beam into the space below. It was larger than she'd expected. While only a 3-foot-high gap was visible from the outside, the ground dipped just past the entrance, creating nearly enough room for a person to stand upright. It was hard to see with only a small circle of light, but there seemed to be items already stored in the space below her home. She saw something that looked like a broken chair, as well as a pile of bags nestled into the corner. The house's support pillars blocked much of her view, and Allie, with a final glance at the garden, lowered herself into the crawlspace. It was a tight fit through the plywood hole, but just beyond, the ground dropped away, and she was able to move forward when she crouched. The air was much cooler than outside. A smell, dirty, musty, and decayed, hung in the air. Allie pressed her sleeve over her nose to block out the stench and moved towards the plastic bags. They were all sealed, but several had split down the side. They looked as though they were filled with garbage. Did the previous owners seriously leave their trash down here? Allie poked at one of the split bags with her foot, and rags fell out. They looked as if they'd once been clothes, but had been worn down until holes developed and seams broke, making them unwearable. Under the clothes were broken plates and cups and bent cutlery. A quiet scratching noise disturbed her, and Allie turned in time to see a rat scamper out of her torch's light to hide behind. A mattress? Allie approached the lumpy shape, trying to breathe through her mouth as much as possible. The mattress had broken down, and several of its springs poked through the fabric, but strangely enough, someone seemed to have patched it with rags similar to the ones in the bags. It was pressed against one of the support pillars, which had hidden it from view of Allie's hole in the plywood. Beyond the mattress, a handmade shelf stood propped against the wall. Allie moved towards it and then jumped as her foot hit something, sending it clattering across the dirt. She turned the torch down and saw empty tins, dozens of them, littering the ground. A voice in the back of Allie's head had started to panic. It was telling her to get out, and get out fast, but curiosity compelled her towards the shelf. She cast her light over the odd collection arranged on the wooden boards: a plate, a cup, a spoon, a fork, and a knife. Next to them sat 2 candle stubs, burnt down to their bases. On the shelf below stood a strange assortment of toys: a doll, too filthy for use, a pull toy that had lost almost all of its bright paint, and a coloring book propped upright as though it were an art display. Allie reached towards it gingerly and pulled the cover back. The pages inside had been colored so thoroughly and so vigorously that she couldn't see a single inch of white paper. It was almost as though its owner had been over the same pages dozens of times. Even so, the coloring was crude, and in many cases, the artist hadn't even tried to stay within the lines. The final item on the shelf was a Polaroid camera. It reminded Allie of the camera she'd inherited from her grandfather. She thought she still had it in storage somewhere, though she hadn't seen it in years. Nausea was rising in Allie's stomach. She turned towards the crawlspace's exit, and froze. A series of Polaroid photos were stuck to the pillar beside the mattress. They were clumsy and often blurry, but it was impossible for Allie to mistake the subject. The photos were of her. Some showed her digging in her yard, that must have been months ago when I planted the garden, and others were of her leaving the house and locking the door behind herself. A final series, stuck in a place of pride near the mattress's head, had been taken through her bedroom window and showed Allie asleep in her bed. In the closest photo, Allie wore the pajamas she'd purchased just a week previously. Allie's hand rose to cover her mouth. She turned towards the square of light in the plywood wall, her escape, and inhaled sharply. A person, or something that resembled a person, stood in the light. His face was strangely sagged, as though his body had been sucked dry. His eyes bugged out of his head with a terrific intensity. Limp hair ran down to frame his cheeks, which housed an unnaturally large mouth. Then his mouth opened, splitting into a smile, as the batteries in Allie's light died. Next story. Host. Kira muted her television and frowned at the caller ID flashing on her phone. Jessica Kerbal. She hadn't thought of Jessica in years, let alone heard from her. She, Jessica, and Adelaide had been close friends in school. Just seeing her name brought up a myriad of memories, weekly sleepovers, fights over toys, and, as they'd gotten older, fights over boys. At the time, their bond had felt unbreakable. Time had eroded the friendship, of course, as it did everything. When Kira's friends split up to go to different high schools, she'd found it surprisingly easy to move into new friendships and forget the old, and seemingly childish, camaraderie. So how did Jessica get my number? And why is she calling me now, after more than 10 years of silence? If she wants to recruit me to one of those pyramid scheme makeup parties, she can think again. Kira pressed the green answer button and held the mobile to her ear. Hello. The voice on the other end let out a relieved breath. It sounded oddly scratchy and distant, but the tone was shockingly familiar. Kira. Hey, it's Jessica. From school. Do you remember? Yeah, of course. Kira forced a note of brightness into her voice. It felt surreal to be talking to her childhood friend, as though she'd somehow stepped back in time. How are you? Wow, it's been ages. Jessica chuckled. It sure has. I've been great. Though I've always felt bad that we didn't stay in touch. Do you think we could meet up? Maybe she does just want to reconnect, after all. Yeah, I'd love that. Let me take you out for coffee. No, I mean tonight. Can you meet me tonight? Kira's subconscious prickled. Something about the urgent note in the other woman's voice was unsettling. Jessica quickly added, I know, I'm sorry. I wouldn't ask, except it's urgent. It's about Adelaide. Adelaide Dew, the third member of our miniature clique. She was heart-set on being a vet, wasn't she? Is something wrong with her? Kira sat forward in her couch. The muted television had moved on to a commercial break, and an enthusiastic woman was demonstrating how much liquid her mopping cloth could absorb. Jessica was silent for a very long time. When she finally spoke, a fake brightness saturated her voice. It's really something I need to talk to you about in person. Can you come? Tonight? The unsettling prickles evolved into an anxious buzz. Where? We could meet up in the car park by the convenience store in Mendel Street. In Reddington. Is that okay with you? At least it's a public place. Not that I don't trust her. I just don't trust her. That's fine. I'll be 20 minutes. Kira almost never visited Reddington, and she had never been to the convenience store Jessica wanted to meet at. It wasn't a good part of town. Half of the shops she passed were closed, and the other half looked as though they were barely hanging on. Tape held together fractured windows on houses, or cardboard-covered spaces where the windows had been completely broken. Kira hadn't seen a single other human on the street she'd passed, though there seemed to be no shortage of stray animals. The streetlights that still functioned did an appalling job of lighting the grime-coated pathways. Her uneasiness was growing with each turn she took. Maybe Jessica's on drugs and is going to beg for money. Or just straight up rob me. Those concerns weren't at all alleviated when Kira arrived at where the convenience store should have been and found a long-abandoned shell of a building. Part of the roof had collapsed. The only light came from the glow of street lamps in the road that ran behind the store. This is insane. I've got to get out of here. As she coasted past the abandoned shop, she saw a figure standing near the shopping cart corrals. Its pose was, in a strange way, incredibly familiar. The woman, Jessica, stepped forward and waved an arm in an attempt to attract Kira's attention. I should go. This place doesn't bode well. Jessica was waving both arms. She looked desperate. Damn it. Kira pulled into the parking lot and put on the handbrake, but she didn't remove the keys from the ignition. She got out of her car and carefully moved towards Jessica, who was waiting for her by the corral. "Thanks for coming," Jessica said, beaming at her. Kira hoped her shock wasn't too apparent. Her childhood friend had changed incredibly in 10 years. She'd once been plump, with dimples in her cheeks and a bouncy kind of energy. That night, she seemed to be nothing except for bones. Her skin drooped heavily, and deep gray shadows rimmed her eyes, which were bloodshot and slightly unfocused. Only the energy remained, and she was expressing it in strange tics and hand flutters. "How've you been?" Kira asked, trying not to look as repulsed as she felt. Jessica smiled, her pale lips stretching into a shape that looked more like muscle memory than genuine emotion. "Great. Absolutely great. You're looking well. That's good. They take so much out of you, you really don't want to be going into it when you're already weak." "What?" Kira had begun backing up, trying to put more distance between herself and the gaunt woman, but Jessica was pacing forward and closing whatever gaps Kira built. "It's really important, though," Jessica said. The plastic smile had frozen across her face. "That's what they say, anyway. I don't really understand it. But then, they don't want me for my brainpower, you know. They just need a host." Kira, now desperate to leave, turned towards her car. A second woman stood in front of the open driver door. Her face was masked in shadows, but Kira thought that behind the sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, and bloodless lips, the bone structure was faintly familiar. Yes, that's Adelaide. She called me first. But now it's my turn to recruit a new host, and I chose you." Kira turned back to her old friend and screamed. Jessica's face was distorting. Her jaw stretched horrifically wide, and something dark was moving at the back of her throat. Kira staggered backward, too horrified to look away as small, slimy black insects began crawling across Jessica's tongue. They looked nothing like any creature Kira had seen before. A multitude of twitching legs and large transparent wings extended from flat, shiny bodies. The wings fluttered open, and the insects took flight when they reached Jessica's lips. Kira turned to run, but two unexpectedly strong arms wrapped around her torso and pinned her in place. "Open wide," Adelaide whispered. Kira could feel the other woman's sagging flesh pressing into her as the vice-like arms squeezed. "It will only take a moment." Then the small, wet insects began hitting Kira's face. Their scratching feet felt across her cheeks and dug at her lips. Kira couldn't stand it any longer. She screamed, and the creatures gladly took advantage of the invitation to enter their new host. Next story. Snowbound. The screech of tires shook Jacques out of his sleep. The abrupt stop lurched him forward in the train seat, and his newspaper flopped to the ground. He blinked a few times to wake himself up, then looked out the window. Snow had been falling steadily and blanketed the mountainous region in white. Far in the distance, the black foothills were barely visible in the twilight, and every few meters, a clump of weedy, straggly green trees poked through the snow. The train wasn't supposed to stop until it reached its destination, Holberg, on the other side of the mountains. Jacques glanced around to see if he might have missed an announcement, but the train's other occupants seemed just as confused as he was. The two fashionable ladies a few seats behind him were talking quickly in a language he didn't recognize. The young man who'd been eyeing the fashionable ladies was glancing about the carriage as though someone might be able to explain the delay. The thick-set bearded man and his petite wife opposite Jacques were quiet, but they seemed just as puzzled. "What's going on?" the young man asked. "Are we there already?" "Not for another few hours," the bearded man replied. He rose from his seat with a sigh. "Let me check." The carriage was silent during the few minutes that the bearded man was gone. When he returned, he only shrugged. "They say we're snowed in. Isn't this supposed to be a snowproof train? The young man sounded indignant. One of the fashionable ladies made a comment to her friend, and they both had to smother snickers. There's no such thing as a snowproof train, Jacques said, shuffling his newspaper back into order and folding it on the seat beside himself. This one is designed to make it through light and moderate snow, but will still be stymied by anything heavy. Still, though, the young man said, looking out the window, it's not quite heavy, is it? Jacques had to agree. The snow was thick enough to blanket, but he thought he would still be able to walk through it reasonably well. The train shouldn't have any problems, but of course, there were a multitude of inconveniences that might have stopped them, such as an avalanche, falling rocks, or even just tracks that had succumbed to the weather and broken apart. One of the train's assistants burst through the door at the back of the carriage and dashed down the aisle. The young man tried to call to him, but the assistant didn't stop. Jacques had a brief impression of a blanched white face and bulging eyes before the man was past him, the air displaced by his motion ruffling the newspaper. Then he was through the door at the other end of the carriage, presumably moving towards the train's engine. The young man was demanding explanations again, even though it was clear that no one in the carriage knew any more than he did. Jacques tuned him out as he stared through the window at the softly drifting snow. He shifted forward in his seat and frowned. Despite the strength of the moon, the patchy trees and high mountains left most of the surrounding terrain in shadows. Jacques thought, though, that he'd seen a shape moving through the woods, just beyond the square of light coming from his window. A person or a wolf? A voice came through the train's intercom, sounding hurried and terse. Apologies for this brief delay, it said at the same time as the train gave a jolt and began moving in reverse. We have encountered unexpected obstacles and are required to return to Lakeview for tonight. What? The young man rose out of his seat. That's a full 2 hours away. Hush, the thick-set man said. Jacques noticed he was squeezing his wife's hand. I'm certain they have a good reason. But I have a hotel booked. Jacques didn't interrupt, but a prickling worry dug at him. He remembered his mother telling him stories about the mountains and the snow beasts that hid in their caves. Fairy tales, of course. But still. The train was gradually picking up speed, slinking along the track, away from the narrow mountain pass it had been trying to move through. Jacques had barely relaxed in his seat when it gave another jolt. What now? The young man snapped, but everyone else in the carriage froze. The motion hadn't been anything remotely like the way a train was supposed to move. It was a harsh jerk in the wrong direction, as though something monumentally large was pulling the train to a halt. Then the sound of screaming metal filled the carriage, making the fashionable women clasp their hands over their ears. The young man, the bearded man, and Jacques pulled their windows open and leaned their torsos as far out of the train as they dared. Jacques looked towards the front carriage, but the night and flurries obscured the view. He thought, however, that the carriage seemed to be tilting upwards. Run, the bearded man cried, pushing his wife out of her seat and dragging her towards the carriage's rear door. It has the train. Stop looking. Run. Everything was in motion. Jacques pushed out of his chair and joined the others running to the carriage's door as the sounds of screams from farther up in the train reached him. He followed the fashionable ladies outside, into the icy mountains. The frozen wind bit at his face, but he didn't dare go back for his luggage. In the distance, he saw the outline of a beast silhouetted against the starry sky, impossibly large, lifting the first carriage clear off its tracks and raising it like a child picking up a toy. Jacques didn't dare look back again, but focused on the ground ahead of him. He heard more carriage doors slam, followed by the screams of their occupants fleeing the shuddering, jerking train. He tried to stay with the group, knowing that survival together was more likely than survival alone, and only realized his error as the forerunner, the young man, screamed. A dark shape had darted out of the shadows and thrown him to the ground. Two more followed it quickly, sinking black teeth into the man's limbs as he fought for his life. It was nearly impossible for Jacques to peel his eyes away, but when he did, he saw more of the black creatures, parasites, his mind told him. They're parasitic creatures picking off the prey brought down by an apex predator, materializing out of the shadows and bringing down the fleeing men and women. Jacques froze, unsure of what to do. Should he return to the carriage, that might afford safety from the black creatures but make him vulnerable to the gigantic, hulking monster that blotted out the moon, or continue with his companions and hope for the best? He never had a chance to make up his mind. The next moment, 3 sets of razor-sharp teeth sunk into his back. Next story. Red Oak House. March parked his car in the weedy driveway and dimmed its lights. The house, 3 stories tall and built from time-stained wood, stood like a sentry on the slope. He admired it for a moment before picking his notebook, pen, and camera off the seat beside him and slipping out of the car. "This'll be the last one," he told himself for the 50th time that day. "The last one, then the book's off to the editor. And, provided I pick the right house, it'll be the best out of all of them." For the past 3 years, March had spent his weekends and evenings researching haunted locations in the Somerset area. The region was supposedly a hotspot for the paranormal, Civil War battle sites, a mass grave, and the state's largest disused asylum created fertile grounds for spiritual unrest. March's research had been meticulous. Every fact was verified and each experience was documented as thoroughly as possible. He'd spoken to all of the area's ghost hunters, both hobbyists and professionals. And one very interesting interview had led him to the Red Oak House. While there had never been a verifiable ghost sighting in the building, the stories amounted to a friend of a friend's account, of which there were versions for almost every old house in the country. The Red Oak House did have an exceptionally dark history. The Gable family had built it in the 18th century. Their eldest son had been considered odd, but no one had ever questioned his sanity until he butchered his entire family and buried their remains in the garden behind the house. The massacre went undiscovered for weeks. When the town realized his crime, the villagers gathered as a mob to storm the home. But the son, rather than let the mob kill him, had hung himself from a window before they could reach him. From then on, every single family who had occupied the house had suffered tragedy. March tried the house's front door first, but it was boarded closed. He glanced behind himself, to where the empty, moonlit rural road stretched in each direction, and then he slunk around the house's side to check the windows and back door. It was technically private property, which meant he was breaking and entering, but no one had lived in the house for more than 2 decades. March suspected the building's owner probably wouldn't have minded if it was burnt to the ground. The Messenger family had moved in following the Gables' deaths. Within a year of occupancy, the father choked to death on a fish bone. Barely 2 months afterward, the eldest son was kicked in the head by a horse and died in hospital. When the youngest child drowned in the river behind the house, Mrs. Messenger took her 2 remaining children and fled the home. The back door was also boarded over, but the window beside it was missing its glass. Using his jacket sleeves as protection, March hoisted himself over the sill and dropped into the kitchen. The room looked almost perfectly intact. A layer of grime seemed to coat every surface, and dead leaves and insects were scattered over the wood floor. Pots still hung on their hooks above the range, and when he opened the fridge's door, March found it full of long-rotted food. He took a few steps back and photographed the room. After the Messenger family, a young couple, the Stalleys, had taken up residence. Heavily pregnant, Mrs. Stalley had been attempting to draw water from the well behind the house when she'd stumbled and fallen into it. Her husband didn't hear her screams and only discovered her body hours later. He'd been so grieved that he'd turned the shotgun from the mantel on himself. March followed the kitchen through to the living room. The furniture sat where it had been left for 2 decades, the fabric was slowly rotting in the humid air. March examined the paintings on the wall and then took several photos of the room before continuing to the staircase. The house had remained empty for nearly 5 years following the Stallies' deaths and was then occupied by the Volkers, an immigrant family. The youngest child swallowed lye. His sibling fell from the third-floor window. Mrs. Volkers overdosed on her medication. Mr. Volkers was run over by his own truck when he forgot to use the handbrake. All within the span of 2 years. The stairs groaned under March's weight as he climbed them. The air tasted stagnant and sour, tainted by the decay of rooms that desperately needed tending. The second-last family, the Smythes, left immediately after the death of their nephew, who'd been staying with them. He'd fallen into the threshing machine while it was running. March turned left at the top of the stairs and began exploring and photographing each room he passed. There was a vast amount of history buried in them. He found a diary, which he pocketed, and several photo albums from the last occupant. Mary Jacobson was the only single person to purchase the house, and she was the only resident whose death hadn't been confirmed. She'd lived there for 6 months then abruptly gone missing. While rumors circulated about possible grisly deaths, her neighbors believed she'd seen something supernatural and fled. The day before her disappearance, she'd mentioned hearing strange noises at night and feeling uncomfortable in her home. If she'd left, she'd done so in a hurry. Her clothes were in the closets, eaten to shreds by moths and age. The police reports said her dinner plate was still soaking in the sink when the search parties combed the house looking for her. March opened the door to the final room, Mary's bedroom. It was neat, but dusty. He took 2 photos then began methodically opening the wardrobes and searching for any details that could enrich his book. In one corner was a small frame set into the wall, holding a wooden door. March opened the door and glanced inside. It was a dumbwaiter. When the house was first built, the narrow chutes were common and used to carry food to the upper levels. March pointed his torch down the hole and said very quietly, "Oh." At the bottom of the chute, where the box would have normally been, lay a pile of cloth. In amongst the cloth peeked little slivers of white bone. March drew back, his mouth dry, as the shock of his discovery battled with morbid excitement. The house had claimed Mary after all. Somehow, she'd fallen into the chute. Did she die on impact, or was she still alive when her neighbors searched her house the following day? March took a step backward and raised the torch to photograph the chute. He was a second too late to hear the rotten wood cracking under his feet, as the house, long starved, claimed another victim. Next story. Overheard. "Hey," Kylie said, flipping backward onto the couch and kicking off her sneakers. She noticed she had a hole in one sock, and wiggled the exposed toe. "Hey yourself," Sarah said from the other end of the phone. "I miss you already, girl." Kylie laughed as she stared at the decorative plaster bordering the ceiling. It was fancy. Too fancy, she decided, as though the house were trying to seem classier than a rural farmhouse had any right to be. "Nowhere near as much as I miss you. And Jem. And Tammy. I swear I'm going to die of boredom before this week's up." Ugh. Kylie could imagine her best friend rolling her eyes as she twisted the phone's cord around her fingers. "Then come back. It's not as if the house is going to die if it's left alone for too long." Kylie groaned. "Mom says it's going to build character. I think she's hoping I'll turn into a country bumpkin while I'm here. Plus, she says we still owe the Joneses for that time they looked after our dog." Aha. But there's literally nothing to do here. It's like an hour to walk to the shops, and there's nothing there except ugly fashion and a really nasty milk bar. Kylie rolled onto her side to look at the lounge room. She wasn't sure if the house needed new bulbs or if it had been built by an idiot, but the building never seemed bright enough, no matter how many lights she turned on. As soon as evening hit, the shadows clustered in and dimmed the room until she struggled to make out details in the corners and behind the multitude of bookcases. "Hey, there's got to be something fun to do there." A teasing note had crept into Sarah's voice. feeding chickens, sitting in a rocking chair for hours on end, sewing. Shut up. Kylie made a face, even though her friend couldn't see her. Sarah laughed. In the moment of silence that followed, Kylie thought she detected a noise in the background of the phone. What is that? Breathing? Hey, did you hear that? She asked. The noise was interrupted by what sounded like a fridge door opening and rustling as Sarah looked inside. Hear what? Like, exhaling. Yeah, I do that sometimes. A container thudded onto a bench, and a lid was pulled off with a pop. She's into the ice cream, then. Her parents can't be home. Yeah, but this sounded really never mind. Has Travis said anything about me? Forget him, Sarah said, her voice muffled as she filled her mouth with ice cream. He's not worth your time, girl. Kylie didn't reply. In the few seconds of dead air, she heard the breathing again. That can't be Sarah. You can't breathe like that with your mouth full. Hey, did you? Yeah, I heard it that time, Sarah said, sounding annoyed. That'll be the brat listening in on our call again. Tyler, get the hell off the phone. An exhale filled the pause in their conversation, and Kylie sat up on the couch, suddenly feeling cold. It had sounded, sick somehow, as though the person were breathing through a damaged larynx. She'd heard the sound before, years ago, when her grandmother was dying of throat cancer. She would have been happy to never hear it again. Tyler. Sarah repeated, sounding angry. I swear I'll beat your ass for this. Get off the damn phone. The inhale, this time, was sticky and rattling. Kylie wrapped her arms around her torso. Sarah, are you sure? Hang on. Let me go punch some sense into the brat, Sarah said. He must be using Mum's bedroom phone. Be back in a tick. Kylie heard a click as Sarah placed the receiver on the kitchen bench, then her friend's footsteps thundered in the distance, accompanied by her yelling, "This is why everyone hates you, you ass." Kylie let her eyes rove across the room as she waited. The shadows seemed to be thickening, as though they were seeping out of their corners and bleeding across the room. She had the distinct impression that, if she waited long enough, the darkness would swallow her. She closed her eyes and tapped her feet together, suddenly keen to hear her friend on the phone again. Instead, the rasping, rattling breath returned, followed by a voice. It was a sound Kylie knew she'd never forget, cracked and somehow bubbling, as though the sounds had been drawn through a mangled neck. Despite that, the voice seemed pleased with itself, almost taunting. Hello, Kylie, it said, accompanied by another rattling breath. You left the back door unlocked. Kylie's mouth opened, though she didn't make a sound. The receiver clicked as the caller placed it back in its cradle. 2 beats passed, and then Sarah picked up her phone again, sounding breathless. It wasn't Tyler, she said. He's downstairs, playing video games with his friend. The receiver dropped from Kylie's hands as the door behind her opened. Next story. An empty church. What do you think it is? Clara asked, then corrected herself. Was. Church. Sam nodded towards the cross adorning the steeply slanted roof. Must be old, though. I didn't think anyone lived near here. Clara turned to glance at the trees behind them. They'd been crossing from the town to Sam's house, using the Potts Forest as a shortcut, when they'd become lost. Not that being lost in Potts Forest was dangerous, the woods were crisscrossed with hiking trails and roads. All the friends needed to do was keep walking until they came across a pathway, then follow it back to town. Neither of them had been expecting to find signs of habitation in the forest, though. Want to look inside? Sam grinned, and her braces reflected in the low afternoon light. Clara sighed. Really? Come on, yeah. Let's see what's left inside. The church wasn't large. It was even smaller than Clara's house, even. Sam was first to the door, and she pushed it open and then wiped her hands on her jeans. "It's slimy. Wood's rotting," Clara noted. "Better be careful in there." Sam made a mocking noise. "It's not that derelict. Come on." Inside, the church was so dim that Clara had to squint to make out the shapes. Rows of ancient, carved wooden pews faced the front of the church, where a simple pulpit stood below a stained glass window. Clara blinked at the image in the glass, but it didn't seem to be any sort of religious scene. It showed a gigantic snake coiled in on itself, its mouth swallowing its tail so that it became a circle. The serpent's teeth pierced its own scales, sending rivulets of blood onto the black ground below it. Clara shuddered and turned away. A communion table stood at the front of the church, its once white crocheted cloth discolored and tatty from age. Clara approached the table and looked over the ornaments. There were no communion cups or baskets for bread. Instead, a range of ornate, decadently twisting knives was laid out on the stained cloth, and a large bowl stood in the center of the table. The bowl's contents had dried during the decades the church had been forgotten, but it had left a black sediment in the base. Clara found herself imagining a congregation lining up to slice their hands and mingle their blood in the bowl. She forced herself to look away. "This place is too weird." "Sam. Ready to go?" Clara hoped she'd kept the anxiety out of her voice, but she couldn't stop it from thundering through her veins as she looked about the room and saw she was alone. "Sam." No answer. Clara crossed her hands over her chest and tried to slow her breathing. She moved to the center of the church and looked up and down the rows of pews. A door, one she couldn't remember seeing before, stood open below the stained glass window. Clara squinted at it. She thought she could hear faint noises coming from the darkness, halting, stumbling footsteps, and shoes scraping across the stone floor. Clara reluctantly approached the door and held her breath to listen to the sounds. The footsteps mingled with a voice, but the sound was too low for her to understand what it was saying. She glanced down and saw the dust had been wiped off the door handle. Someone had gone that way recently. Clara cleared her throat, but her voice still came out as a whisper. "Sam." "Yes, Clara." Sam's voice, placid, came from inside the doorway. "Sam, get out of there. I want to go." Silence. Clara leaned into the doorway, hoping to see her companion. The faint light from the church's entrance and the holes in the roof couldn't illuminate more than the first few steps, but she could see a stone stairwell leading downwards. "Does the church have a basement?" "Sam." Clara called again, but there was still no response. Clara steeled herself, then stepped over the threshold and into the stairwell. Almost immediately, the darkness engulfed her, making her feel cloistered and smothered. She tried to draw breath, but it felt like inhaling water. She tried to call, but her voice stuck in her throat. Moving her feet felt like dragging her limbs through mud, but she moved forward slowly and deliberately as the blackness pressed in on her from all sides. Panic rose through her chest as she tried to call again and found her voice choked. She turned back to find the door, but all was darkness. She couldn't see the light, she couldn't see the door, and she couldn't see Sam. She tried to scream, but the sound was doused before it could even reach her own ears. "I'm suffocating." Even though she was still dragging breaths into her lungs, it felt nothing like any sort of air she'd inhaled before. Dead and heavy, it made her want to retch. She flung herself forward, towards where she thought the door had been, but her fingers grazed only the air. Her feet slipped out from under her as she fell forward. She braced herself to hit the floor, but instead, she slammed into the door, upright. Clara took a stumbling half-step back but didn't dare take her fingers away from the doorframe. She scrabbled over it, searching for the handle, and a way out, as she fought to inhale the toxic substance that threatened to drown her. A choking sob escaped her raw throat, but the sound was perfectly smothered. She couldn't hear a thing, not her heartbeat, not the sounds of her fingernails splintering as she clawed at the door with increased desperation, and not the sounds of her hungry, futile gasps. Then the door swung open on its own, and Clara stumbled through it. She was back in the forest, facing the path she and Sam had been following. She drew a sharp, gasping breath, relieved to feel real air in her lungs again. When she turned, she found the church just behind her, its front door wide open. That's impossible. She rotated to see the forest again and caught sight of a figure near the edge of the trees. She recognized the jeans and slightly too large sweater and stumbled towards her friend. Sam. Sam turned slowly. Her face was sheet white and coated with sweat, and her eyes, normally a bright brown, were deadened, as though she'd seen things Clara couldn't even dream of. Sam. Clara repeated, grabbing at her friend's arm. Sam blinked at her once and drew a shuddering breath. I want to go home.